Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Leslie Williams. I'm a learning coordinator here at NTC, and we are very excited to have you be joining us. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. Myself and my teammate Rachel are here to help you. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Suzanne is going to be introducing us to our amazing speaker.
Thank you, Leslie. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Care for the Wounded Helper presentation with Scott Webb. This amazing free training is being supported through a partnership between Taylor County Health Department, Taylor County Human Services, North Central Technical College, and the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. We will be recording and sharing this session following the event. Copies of the handout will be dropped in the chat. Leslie will do that here shortly for you if you have not already received them. Don't forget to complete your evaluations at the conclusion of this presentation. And this topic can be heavy, so please take care of yourself as we learn and reflect together over the next 90 minutes. Please enjoy. Scott?
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, NTC, for the opportunity to be a part of this training. And this training, the way I created it, it kind of happened by accident. Before I get to that, just a quick introduction. I'm the trauma-informed care coordinator at Department of Health Services. I've been in that role now for a little over 10 years, and at last count, I've trained over 21,000 people on trauma-informed care principles, and that's been mainly what I do for the last 10 years. As far as who I am a person with lived experience with trauma. I grew up in a family where there's a lot of domestic violence, and it really impacted my health in ways I did not expect. For instance, at age 16, I was diagnosed with a peptic ulcer, and a lot of it was due to the chaos and the stress that I was living in at home. And then about 9 years ago, I had a widowmaker heart attack, which has only a 6% survival rate, and I'm one of the 6%, fortunate enough to still be here. And it didn't dawn on me at the time, even though I was already working in this job at DHS, that I was the poster child for somebody with a high ACE score, a lot of adverse childhood experiences and health issues. It didn't dawn on me that I was really overweight, really unhealthy, and I was a prime candidate for a heart attack. So my doctor at the time said if I would have waited another half hour to get help, I wouldn't be here today because it is such a deadly type of heart attack. But that ushered me into the world of self-care because I wasn't very good at that before, because I'm like a lot of other helpers out there. We're very much other focused. We're really good at taking care of other people because we have these deep wells of empathy that make us so effective at what we do when we come along other human beings who are hurting. And maybe we have our own trauma stuff. And I'm going to get into that in a little while, like myself. And we're drawn to the field because of, maybe we've been through this before and we want to be that person that makes a difference in a positive way in someone's life. But that whole idea of self-care was something that it was that 2x4 in the head where I'm like, you need to do something different, Scott, to take care of yourself. So I started doing that on my own, just kind of quietly going about my own business and taking care of myself, losing weight, trying to work out. I still work out multiple times a week. I know a Peloton. I use a Peloton instead of working out at the gym. That was because of the pandemic. But speaking of the pandemic, you know how that changed our world. And it's still, I think we're still feeling the effects of what happened during COVID-19. Right early on during the pandemic, I received a call from somebody up in the Fox Valley who is responsible for working with people that work with those who are homeless, who have no permanent housing. And she was telling me, she asked me, she says, I know you do trauma-informed care training, but I'm wondering, do you have anything on self-care for people that are on the front lines trying to do this hard work right now during this pandemic? And I said, not really. That wasn't my main, that wasn't the lane I'm supposed to be in for DHS. But then I started thinking about it with her. We're really just thinking out loud and brainstorming together. I'm like, well, I really want to help meet your need. So let's talk about what self-care should look like during the pandemic. And so we had conversation, and I said, well, what are you seeing in your staff that tells you that they're not doing well? She's like, well, they don't take care of themselves. Their boundaries are really bad. There's a flag I can identify with. And they really have a hard time saying no when they should be saying no to things, and they're just overexerting, overextending themselves. They're not taking care of themselves. So I said, how about if we came up with a training that looked at boundaries and create and assertiveness skills? And her eyes lit up. She's like, yes, that's exactly what I need. And I thought, well, let's see what I can do. Let's see what I can put together. And so I did my research and I started to figure this out. I used some of my own experiences as a heart attack survivor. And I came up with this training that we're going to do today. And I didn't know if it was going to be any good. I thought maybe it'll be okay. Maybe it'll stink. I don't know. Well, we're going to try it. So I did the training, and there was somebody in the audience who it was a virtual training like this one, and they talked to somebody else. And the long story short, somebody at Department of Health Services in a different division, administrator, heard about it and wanted me to do it for their group. So I did it for their group during the pandemic, and he loved it so much so that he started talking to the federal people. And so I did this training during the pandemic for uh, Region 5 of the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. They had this COVID task force or this COVID team, and they were trying to create trainings around that. So I did the training there, and it was really well received. I'm like, okay, holy cow, this is really amazing. So I've been doing this training since the pandemic more frequently than I would have thought. And so hopefully this will be helpful for you, for all of you today, but I just sort of look at it as I'm a fellow traveler. I don't by any means put myself as an expert on any of this. I have learned a lot. I'm at the end of my career. I'm retiring in 3 weeks, so and one of the weird things as I look at my training schedule for the rest of September, I have one trauma-informed care training schedule. All the rest are this one. In fact, I'm doing this tomorrow in Stevens Point for Department of Workforce Development. So it's really interesting how this has become very people are very interested in this topic, and I think it's because we're really struggling, especially post-pandemic, and how to deal with all of this. So that's what we're going to do today. Again, I'm a fellow traveler, and I try to put myself in the story as much as I can. In that, I'm trying to tell you that I'm trying to practice what I'm talking about. So what I want to do today in our time together, and I don't know if we're going to have 90 minutes worth of content, so I'm going to be depending on all of you with any questions you might have, any insights. I'm going to try to pause occasionally to see if anyone has anything to share about what we're talking about. But this is just what I've been in my research and my own experiences working for almost 40 years in behavioral health. These are the things that I've noticed and seen. So we're going to talk about trauma today because I think at the root, a lot of maybe our inability or our lack of awareness around taking care of ourselves is maybe a lot of us come from a trauma background. We're trauma survivors too. And what I've noticed when I've talked to other trauma survivors is that they are very much caretaker types, personality types, maybe because of what they've been through. And I'll talk more about that later on. But I think a lot of us are trauma survivors and we're doing the best we can, but we need to talk about how trauma affects us and how whether we've healed from that trauma or not may affect the way that we show up for work and how we do the work and how we take care of ourselves while we're trying to do the work, if that makes sense. I want to talk about secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout because especially during the pandemic, post-pandemic, but it was certainly true before the pandemic, this is a big ticket item. This is huge. A lot of people are walking around with secondary traumatic stress. And they don't even realize it or have the insight around that. They may be dealing with compassion fatigue, and maybe some, you know, bless their hearts, they're burned out and they're trying to do the work, but they're finding themselves being very ineffective. And then we'll pivot from that to talk about passive, assertive, and aggressive communication styles, because I think that that sets the table for whether we can engage in smart self-care or not. And that's a part of what we're going to be talking about, along with setting healthy boundaries. And well, how do we do that? I mean, for me, it's been difficult because I am somebody who I'm a people pleaser. And my trauma background, my trauma experience has kind of led me to the place where I'm trying to be the counselor, the referee in my family when I was growing up and trying to calm everybody down. And that's kind of followed me throughout my life, even in this job. So we really need to keep an eye on how we set boundaries or not. And then I'll talk a little bit about resiliency, and it's our responsibility to build up our own resiliency. And then we'll have some questions at the end. But I want to start today with this quote by Dr. Peter Levine, and I'll tell a story. I like to tell stories, so if you've been through any of my training before, you probably have heard these stories, and I apologize, I guess, if you've heard them, but I like to think that maybe it'll hit you differently if you know this time compared to before. But and the other thing I don't do, and you are welcome ahead of time, is I do not like to read my PowerPoint slides. Occasionally I will, but this one I need to do that with because I know I've been in those trainings where you go to a training, you're eager to learn, and then the presenter just reads the PowerPoint slides to you, and that's all they do. And I find that very painful. And I don't want to do that to you either. That's not why you're showing up today. All that being said, Peter Levine talks about trauma being the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. Think about that. I think if we and I really want us all to be very honest today and be very vulnerable and be very real. And again, take care of yourselves. If any of this you find upsetting, I want you to do what you need to do. I can't see you. I just see the little light on my computer telling me my camera's on. I can't see you. So if you need to step away, do what you need to do if any of this is upsetting, because I want you to be as available to this content as you can. But again, all of us have our different levels of tolerance. But anyway, I think trauma is a topic that we are repelled by. We're afraid of it. And I have a story I'm going to share that brings this quote home in living color, if you will. Before the pandemic, maybe 6, 7 years ago, I was doing my 4 hour trauma-informed care training. And we get to the break. It's about 90 minutes in, and we take a break. And so everybody's heading off to do their thing. And this woman of about my vintage, so she had been in the field a while. She was coming up to talk to me, and I could see that she had a look of concern on her face. And she introduced herself, and she's a psychotherapist. And she said, Scott, I need to be really honest with you. I really like what I'm hearing today. I'm learning things I didn't think that were true or that were out there, but the way you're presenting it's making sense to me. I'm like, well, thank you. She said, but I need to share with you some real honesty, and that is I am terrified to talk to my clients and quote unquote go there and talk about their trauma. Because instinctively I know that they may come from a trauma background, they may be trauma survivors, but I'm afraid to go there because I'm afraid that they're going to have a meltdown in my office and I'm not going to know what to do to help them. And she said, if I'm going to be really honest with you, she said, I'm terrified I'm going to melt down too. And I'm not going to know what to do with that. So I just stay away from it. And we didn't get a chance to talk about it more, but I thought about it on my drive home because I was a number of hours away and I was thinking about what she said. And I thought, like I said at the very beginning this morning, I think a lot of us in the helping professions, we are drawn to the field because maybe of our own past painful experiences as children or adults or whatever. And that we want to be that person that makes a difference in somebody's life that's going to be positive, that be that person that we needed to have when we were walking through it. And that's a very noble thing, and that's a lovely thing, and that's something that passion. And if you are an empathetic person, you have a lot of empathy. That is a gift. That is a wonderful gift to have because not everybody has it. They don't have it maybe in enough capacity to be helpful, but we do. That's why we're drawn to the field. But how many of us have done our own digging in the dirt? I'm going to quote Peter Gabriel because I love his music. I'm a big Peter Gabriel fan, even after with Genesis outside. Anyway, Peter Gabriel has a song he wrote called Digging in the Dirt. When you read the lyrics, clearly he had been somebody that had been in therapy. But I wonder how many of us are drawn to the field because of our past experiences, past painful experiences, but we have never, ever done our own work, trauma work. So when we hear stories, when we hear of experiences, when people who are vulnerable are sharing their pain with us, and we're bearing witness to that pain that we feel so deeply, but at the same time our limbic brains being activated to go into fight, flight, freeze, and we are afraid of the meltdown because of what we're hearing. And maybe what we're hearing sounds really familiar. I can tell you that after my divorce, I made the choice to go into therapy myself. I didn't want to become abusive like my dad. I never was, thankfully. I was able to keep that away, but I didn't want to turn into that as my children were growing up. So I found a therapist who really, really worked me very hard. And I told them up front, you need to really hold me accountable because I could tell you what you want to hear. I'm a therapist. I could say all the right words and all the right things, but that's just window dressing. I need to get real and I need this to be painful because treatment, if it works well, it's going to hurt, especially when we're digging in the dirt. So she did that. And for 2 years, she had me broken down, crying, working through some stuff with my dad that was very, very powerful and helpful. But I couldn't do this job right now, folks. I couldn't be talking about trauma on a daily basis, immersed in it for the last 10 years if I hadn't done that work, because that was a part of my own personal resiliency in my own wellness plan. I couldn't be well and feel I had permission to take care of myself unless I'd done the work. So I think that we really need to be aware that trauma is a word that we're scared of, and we really need to be, you know, understand what it is, how it affects us, and we need to be trauma informed because that's what the self-care and the wellness will be a lot easier to engage in if we have given ourselves permission to do that and go there. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to give you a quick definition of what trauma is, and I'm not going to read any diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5. You're very welcome again. I'm not going to do that to you, but I'm just going to give you some bullet points. The Greek word for trauma means wound. So I think of trauma, psychological trauma, as an injury, just like physical trauma. So, and we need to be aware that, that wound is very real. And even though we can't see it, it does leave scars that can affect the way that we walk through our lives, the decisions we make, the careers we choose, and whether we feel we have permission or not to take care of ourselves. Trauma is more about a reaction to a traumatic event than the event itself. So it's very subjective because all of us, how many do we have on here right now? We have 49 people on here right now, and we could all experience the same traumatic experience right now and have vastly different responses to it, depending on who we are and what our own experiences, how we're put together, our own innate resiliency, all of that. Dr. Judith Herman calls trauma the disease of disconnection. And what does she mean by that? I think she probably means disconnection on a couple different levels. Number one, a lot of people with trauma histories feel disconnected from their own bodies. And a lot of trauma work is about kind of reconnecting somatically with the body. That's done through yoga and other types of somatic experiencing treatments. But I think a lot of trauma survivors are numb, or they numb themselves out with chemicals, drugs, alcohol, whatever, to not feel the psychological pain of that trauma. And I think a lot of traumatized people disconnect from other human beings. And that's not good because what heals trauma and makes us more available for these wellness activities we're talking about today and feeling we have permission to engage in those activities is those healthy relationships. We need to be in healthy relationship with each other. That's where trauma gets healed. And when that trauma gets healed, or it's in the process of healing, is when we are open to the idea that we are worth standing up for ourselves in assertive ways, asking to get our needs met in respectful ways. We have permission to do that. Trauma is about betrayal and desertion. A lot of traumatized people it affects relationships because of the betrayal and desertion. I can't count on anybody to be there for me because everyone I've counted on in the past has let me down or they've hurt me in both. So a lot of traumatized people just feel like they don't know how to get into healthy relationships with people, number one, because they've had nobody to teach them or role model what it looks like. And they also learn, how not to take care of themselves. So trauma is anything that's overwhelming. If it happens too much, too fast, too soon, too long, that is very painful. That is a type of trauma. Then you couple that with not being supported or believed when something bad happens to you, that makes the trauma even worse. And we know that trauma lives in the body. It's stored up in the body at the cellular level. I've had people tell me in my training over the years that they've taken up yoga and they've noticed that sometimes people in these yoga classes will be doing these poses and they begin to weep uncontrollably. And I've had a number of yoga instructors validate this over the years. Why is that? Why would that happen? Well, I think part of the reason might be that because trauma lives at the cellular level, when you engage in yoga or deep tissue massage or acupuncture, acupressure, those things can trigger a very powerful response. Usually that trauma is trying to get out of the body. It's like a toxin. And so it comes out in very powerful emotions. So the quote that I resonate with is, our organs weep the tears our eyes cannot shed. And I think about back when I was 16 and I'm sitting in my family doctor's office and he's droning on and on about, I need to just calm down and don't be so stressed out because I had an ulcer. And it was unusual for him to see a 16-year-old patient in his office with an ulcer. He didn't know what I was living in. He didn't know the kind of chaos that I've been living in for a number of years of sort of marinating in this constant stress and trauma that was going on. So the other quote that I like, I got this from somebody a couple of years ago on my training. She's a yoga instructor. Interestingly, she said, "Yeah, we know that. We always said our issues live in our tissues." And I smiled at her and I said, "I am so going to steal that because I will steal from my audience. If you give me anything good, chances are it may show up on a slide at some point." But I really love that. It really summarizes what we're talking about. And there's different types of trauma. They're not all the same. And I think we need to just quickly review what these are so we can understand not all traumas are the same and they don't affect us the same way. And we could experience different types of traumas. We could have a lot of these. So acute trauma would be the type of trauma that's a single event trauma, has a beginning, a middle, and an end to the event. It's contained. And it usually happens to adults, but not always. And it tends to happen to adults that have pretty good psychological makeup. So they'll bounce back fairly quickly from this type of trauma if they get the right care at the right time. And when I worked for employee assistance before I came to DHS, I did do some debriefings in the workplace following an acute traumatic event. And just being together for 60 minutes, sharing how that event affected each of us if we feel like talking, and then we would normalize and validate each other's experiences. I could see that healing happen even within a 60-minute group conversation. So that's the good news about acute trauma. You can bounce back from it fairly quickly if you have the right care, but sometimes acute trauma can be horrifying, like these shootings we hear about. Those are life altering, and it takes a lot of treatment and work to come out the other side of that. Complex trauma is different because this is not a single event trauma. This is multiple event trauma. And it doesn't happen to adults. It usually happens to small children and vulnerable adults. So there's a real power differential between the person perpetrating the trauma and the person who's being victimized in those traumatic incidents. And it can go on for days, months, and years. And those complex traumas are very, very powerful. They're very, very hurtful, and they can alter a person's life course significantly. In fact, most of the major clinical issues we see in substance use disorders, mental health, co-occurring. If we were to screen and assess these people, we would find out that a lot of them come from complex trauma experiences. Historical trauma would be a trauma that a group of people have experienced. An example would be American chattel slavery, the Holocaust, the violent colonization of Native American and indigenous people in this country, because they have specific stories and events that took place in their history that are still affecting them today. And I have been honored enough to provide training over the last 10 years for a number of the tribes in Wisconsin. And whenever we get to the historical trauma part of the presentation, we usually have to hit pause and we have to have some conversation because there are stories to be shared, because people in the room will talk about what happened to grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle, mom, dad in the boarding schools. So historical trauma is a very powerful type of trauma that can carry on throughout generations. And we see the young people today of these groups of people still kind of acting out and dealing with those ripple effects from that trauma that may have taken place, generations ago. Sanctuary trauma would be a trauma that happens within your sanctuary, the place where you should feel safe. And that could be your home, foster care, receiving medical services, behavioral health services, places of worship. You should feel safe in these places. But when you're being wounded and hurt and traumatized by people that were supposed to keep you safe, that is a very powerful type of trauma, because it's going to be really difficult for you to feel safe with anyone, even yourself or anything, and you're not going to trust. And a lot of people who have significant trauma histories, they don't feel safe with themselves or with anyone else, and they don't trust. And if we heard the stories, we go, I get it. If I had gone through that, I wouldn't trust me either. And I'm going to have to work really hard to earn your trust. So that's a part of it too. Vicarious trauma, we're going to talk a little bit more about in this training today, because that's where secondary traumatic stress comes from. And that's where you're bearing witness to other people's pain. You're seeing them having their worst day over and over again. And usually those of us who are effective in this work are deep feelers. We're very empathetic, deep wells of empathy. And we rely on that empathy to get us through and to help us be effective. And when we're trying to come alongside other human beings who are hurting so much, but that vicarious trauma is a double-edged sword. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Collective trauma would be the trauma that we experienced as part of the pandemic, where the entire world was affected by this trauma. And we really wondered, where is this going? Are the people I care about, are they going to survive this? Am I okay? Am I going to die? What, I mean, there was so much going on, and it was so multi-layered, and it really felt like we couldn't make sense of what was happening, and we didn't know if it was ever going to end. But collective trauma includes pandemics, community violence. We've had plenty of that. Wars, well, there's that going on, and genocide. So collective trauma deals with some very, very, very significant, powerful types of trauma. So let's pivot now. We're going to move away from the trauma. Let's talk more about what we're here to talk about today is the, the wounded healer and how do we deal with that. I love the quote by Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl is a Holocaust survivor. He wrote a number of books about his experience, but the one quote that I keep going back to is this one: what is to give light, or maybe who is to give light, must endure burning. So again, we are often called to this job to maybe be a light in someone's life who's been darkened by past trauma and adversity, and we want to be that light to them and maybe show them the way out of all that darkness. And that's a beautiful thing. But that light also can burn, can hurt you. That's the double-edged sword of empathy, because that which makes you so effective in being a helper can also hurt you if you don't have a good plan on how to take care of yourself. It's imperative for all of us to have a good wellness self-care plan. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. Now, again, I'm coming at this as a heart attack survivor who barely survived what's usually a deadly heart attack, to share with you the importance of self-care, that if you don't do it, it can significantly affect your health and even your life. So we really need to think of it as an essential part of our being an effective helper. And what the research has shown, I'm going to say that we're all helping professionals here in this space today. If we have in our past pre-existing anxiety disorders or mood disorders like depression or personal trauma histories, and I think that's a lot of us if we're totally honest with each other, I think that we are more susceptible to experiencing secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout. I think that we are at a heightened risk for that because we maybe don't have the resources that we need to get us through this very challenging work that we do, this heavy emotional labor. Maybe we've never done our own digging in the dirt. And so we're dealing with that. We're getting upset and triggered by these stories that sound very familiar, and we don't really know how to deal with it. So we're like that woman I talked to at that training. I just don't go there. I don't open up that can of worms. And that reduces our effectiveness as being a helper when we can't bear witness to people's pain and help them through it. And then Dr. Remen, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily. I mean, immersed, that's a really powerful word, really marinating in people's suffering and loss and pain on a daily basis, and have that not affect us. That's as unrealistic as being able to walk through water and not getting wet. We're going to be affected by our work. If we have empathy and we are a caring human being, it's going to affect us. So we have to keep that in mind. And there's a downward slide that we go through. This downward slide of vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress. We are going to experience that. That is going to happen to us because we are bearing witness to people's pain, their discomfort, whether you're a first responder or you're a nurse or a physician, any type of healthcare worker working with the elderly, if you're working in a long-term facility for elderly folks, you're going to deal with vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress. So that's given. Going down the slide would be, if you don't have a good plan on how you're going to deal with that reality, you could end up with suffering from compassion fatigue. We're going to find that in just a moment. Because if you don't take care of it at the compassion fatigue, if you don't have the awareness that you're moving into that state, the final state is where you end up burned out. And that's where people leave the profession. And I know that for a fact that we had a workforce crisis before the pandemic, and wow, it's so much worse now post-pandemic, where a lot of people have left the profession Probably because they're burned out. One of the things I do for DHS is I manage a listserv. Um, the last one I'm doing is coming out next Monday, but I curate a lot of articles that I see online about things dealing with ACEs and trauma and resiliency. And I'm seeing so many articles about physician burnout, nurse burnout, that they're just, and that is scary. If we have this serious, if our healthcare system is that taxed, I worry about the people that are still doing the work, trying to hold down the fort, with fewer people and clients that are caseloads that are going through the roof. We got waiting lists everywhere. So I just wonder, how this is affecting us. In fact, one of the things that maybe we could do real quickly, if you want to get into chat, just maybe drop this in chat if you want to. How has your work changed you personally or professionally? Let's just be honest and let's just put that down. Let's throw it down there and think about how has your work changed you professionally or personally, or both. I'd love to see what you come up with because I think that if we're honest with each other, there's some things that we should be paying attention to. I'll just give it a minute and see if anyone wants to. And if you don't want to put anything down, that's okay too, but I just wanted to leave the invitation. I've become more introverted, need more time alone. My current job has revolutionized my life in every way. I'm learning how to speak about good, Ariel, boundaries while also empathizing and supporting, not to assume what I think people are needing or seeking. Okay. I've learned about my self-worth and giving myself and others grace. Love it. Love it, Ariel. Not judge a book by its cover. So I'm seeing a lot of positive things coming out of this. This is good. You're noticing the glass is half full rather than half empty. But it's this whole experience in your work is really, I can't work in the community where I live because I need space for my mental health. Yeah. More introverted, isolate more from friends. Okay. See, you're getting responses from your peers too, which is really interesting. I'm seeing hearts and thumbs up. So that's resonating. Okay, well, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. If you want to keep dropping them down for your colleagues to see, that'd be great. But I really appreciate your sharing that because, our work can change us. It really can. Can be for the better, can be for the not so good, but we need to be aware of how we're being changed by our work. Because vicarious trauma, again, it's a real thing. And I love the way the ACA put this. They said it's the emotional residue. Think about the emotional residue where you're like got this stuff hanging on you due to the exposure that you have from working with people as you're hearing about their trauma. You're witnessing all the pain and fear and terror. And again, if you're also a trauma survivor, this is going to be even more painful for you. But that vicarious trauma is real. We can't escape it, right? It's there. Because if we don't take care of it, then we end having this emotional, physical fatigue where we're just getting tired. And maybe you wake up in the morning, you wake up tired because you're like just mentally getting to the point where you're just like, man, I could use some time off, but I feel like I don't have permission to ask for time off because I feel guilty because if I do, even though they tell me I should take some time off, I can't because I'm going to leave my teammates holding all this stuff and I feel bad doing that. So I'm going to be a good team member. I'm just going to keep grinding away and grinding away and grinding away. So you're using this empathy. You've got this deep well of empathy. So you're digging deeper into that well to be effective at your work, even though you're tired, emotionally and physically tired. You're still digging and just going down into that barrel of empathy and just really, really trying to be as effective as you can. And that just says about who you are, that you care about human beings. But what about burnout? What if you get to the point of exhaustion, depersonalization, and feeling like you're insufficient? Like I'm terrible at my job now. I cannot do this. This emotional exhaustion. You're at the end of your rope and you just don't have anything left. That barrel of empathy, you're scraping the sides. There's not much, there's nothing in there because you've not poured back into yourself. What we're talking about today is about pouring back into you and not feeling guilty about that, but looking at that as an essential thing that I need to do to be effective at my work. I have to fill this barrel back up. I have to fill the vessel because if I keep pouring out to everybody, there's going to be nothing left. Depersonalization is that cynical, negative thinking. And I'll tell you a quick story about how this can look in the real world. My bachelor's degree is in criminal justice. So I was going to go into law enforcement when I first went to college. And during my senior year, it was the summer, early summer of '84, I was interning at the Appleton, Wisconsin Police Department. And I went there because all the police officers there had college degrees and they practiced community policing, which I really liked. So what I did during the day, I was given an assignment to do a study for one of the inspectors. And then in the evening, I was allowed to do ride-alongs. So one night I was riding with an officer who had a master's degree from Michigan State, highly educated officer, been doing it for a number of years. And we're driving around. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning and we're just kind of chit-chatting. And I told him about that I was just given an opportunity to teach a class as a grad student at UW Oshkosh that I've been proctoring for the last 3 years, study skills class. So I was telling him that I was thinking about maybe going to the counseling program, become a counselor. And master's degree was not part of my plan originally, but then I got this opportunity. And then one of my mentors in the Reading Study Center at UW Oshkosh had thought, you'd make a good counselor. I thought, interesting. So I tell the officer this. He's listening to me. He goes, well, this is me talking, so take it as you want to. He goes, if I were you, Scott, I would do the counseling. I'd go to grad school and get my graduate degree first because when you get to the end of that education and then you become a counselor, it will only make you a better police officer. And then you'll be much more effective because my concern would be that if you do this first, this being becoming a cop first and not do the counseling thing, because my fear is that you're going to become a cold, hard, cynical person like I am. And what I was hearing from him was burnout. And he was being very honest with me. And I really appreciated the honesty and the candor because that helped me make the decision to go to the graduate school. And then it was through that process I learned I was going to be a much better therapist than I was going to be a police officer. So he did me a huge favor. So I tip my hat to that officer, wherever he may be. I'm sure he's retired by now. But that depersonalization is real. That negative, that's excessively, detached from everything. You just don't want to do the job anymore. You just want to get out of it. You can't do it. That's very real. And we have to be aware of it. And then I was doing more research. This is fairly recent stuff now. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Recent research seems to point out that burnout being related to loneliness, social isolation, or exhaustion. I'm thinking, I never thought of burnout and loneliness being together. And I just wonder what you all think about that. You could put down your thoughts in chat if you want to, but I'm just curious about, why would loneliness be connected to burnout? Because I just find that interesting. And then there's this study that kind of looks at longevity and that obesity decreases your longevity by 20%, drinking alcohol 30, smoking or decreases your longevity by 50%, but loneliness, 70% longevity is affected, decreases your longevity. I'm like, wow, that is really significant. So just kind of wondering what you may think about this. And you can drop any thoughts you might have in chat, but how does this all relate? Or because I found it a very interesting connection. Loneliness is in a sense of feeling a lack of support, care, understanding. Okay, Ariel, yeah. Lack of feeling, a lack of support. You're kind of like an island of misery, it feels like, huh? You're just sort of out there on your own if you feel like you don't have no one there. The heart of recovery is community. So if we're burning out and being isolated, we're disconnecting from, okay, very good, Mia. Thank you for that. Yep. Hmm. Yeah, I just found it interesting. I just found it just so fascinating that to connect these two together because Molly says not being ill or wanting to talk about your day with your partner and putting all that trauma on them. Oh, yeah, okay. Don't have the energy to be around anyone. Okay, thank you. Okay, that's helpful. That's very helpful. Because when I discovered this, I put it out to my audience, and you've all been this and other audiences I do this training with. They really give me some really good insights that make a lot of sense. So thank you for that. I appreciate your sharing. because this is something we have to really pay attention to. Signs of getting burned out: being irritated, cynical, negative about everything, feeling depressed, sickness. Then this recent survey from Gallup, uh, they found out of 7,500 employees, 23% reported feeling burned out. And I just think that that is probably even higher in the helping professions because it's such a demanding job. It's emotionally heavy labor. So I just found that very, very interesting. So what are those stressors that also exacerbate all this? Well, bureaucratic issues, COVID-19, certainly. Lack of supervision. I've talked to so many supervisors, and I have a trauma-informed care supervisor training that I do occasionally. And I will hear from them. They'll say, Scott, I wish I could meet with my staff, but I don't have time. There aren't enough hours in the day for me to meet with each of my staff. And the point I always make to them is it's essential. If you want a healthy workplace culture, you have to have open communication. You have to be available and show support to your supervisees. So that lack of supervision is a huge part of this that piles on to all the things we're talking about today. Lack of resources for clients. I hear this a lot in rural areas. I hear about this way up north of Highway 8 in Wisconsin, where helpers are just really stressed and frustrated because of the lack of resources up there. Poor workplace communication. If there's really poor communication going on or no communication, gossip will tend to fill that void. And gossip is hearing something you like about somebody that you don't. Or inadequate orientation and training for their role. People are just there's no onboarding. They're just hired, thrown into the meat grinder, and away they go. And they end up getting chewed up and spit out at the end because there was no support, no training. Talked a lot of this I talked a lot of this already. Risk factors, personal trauma histories can make you more susceptible. High caseloads of clients with trauma-related disorders. I've heard of some counseling agencies where they have their one therapist who's their all-star, and they get all the tough cases. They get all the tough trauma cases. And I often will ask the supervisors about why would they not distribute those to other therapists because they're not as effective. Like, well, is that a training issue then? Are you hiring the right people? Because what's going to happen is that all-star is going to come in one day and they're going to hand you their resignation letter because they can't do it anymore because they're going to be a good employee. They're going to work hard. They're going to grind away, and they probably feel like they don't have time to take care of themselves. They take their work home with them because those boundaries between work and home begin to dissolve, and you start bringing your work home with you, and you're thinking about a hard session or a hard experience, and you can't leave that at work. As a young therapist, I had to learn that very quickly. When I came home, I would actually change my clothes out of my work clothes, my therapist clothes, into my home clothes just to kind of get that new identity. Like now I'm not at work anymore. I'm home. I've set a boundary, and I'm not going to be thinking about that really tough case I just had, an hour earlier. That I'm now going to be here and available to my family and do what I can do to take care of myself. So all these things, being younger in age, new to the field, if you don't have good coping styles, if you learned in your family that you distance and detach when you're stressed out and you don't engage with other people and ask for help, again, maybe that leads to the loneliness I just heard you talk about. There's some connection right there. Lack of tolerance for strong emotions. That could be another trauma survivor feature. So what do we do? Do we have permission to put on our own oxygen mask before we render help to somebody else? If you've ever flown in an airplane, you get this instruction. I just flew for the first time in 10 years this past July to go see my son in Denver, and I heard them say, put on your own oxygen mask before helping somebody else. Why is that? You can't be very effective to someone else if you're struggling for oxygen too. So you have to make sure your needs are taken care of, that you're in the best position possible to help somebody else. And that's what we're talking about today. So we have to have that conversation. I don't think you would let this happen to your cell phone. Now, right now, I'm envisioning all of you picking up your phone to see where you're at. In fact, ironically, my Fitbit just told me that I've got low battery. So I'm talking, just as this screen came up, I got a 10% of battery remaining. So I am literally, my Fitbit watch is telling me I'm in this situation. But we don't want this to happen to us. We don't want our personal battery to look like this. So self-care needs to be a priority, not a luxury. What do I mean by that? Well, Brianna Weiss says it best. Okay, I'm going to read this one too because I love this quote. True self-care is not self baths and chocolate cake, which bums me out. So I like chocolate cake. It's making the choice to build a life you don't need to regularly escape from. Think about that. True self-care. It's making the choice. There's intentionality there to build a life you don't need to regularly escape from. So what does that look like? Well, I'm gonna put my story back in here again. After my heart attack, I was scared to literally almost to death because I almost died. I have 4 stents in my heart now. I have advanced heart disease. I will always have advanced heart disease. I had to make a decision. I was way overweight. I was 270 pounds. I lost 75 pounds in 5 months. I got down to 195, 196 by the summer of 2016. My heart attack was in December of 15. After my cardiac rehab, I had to make a decision. So I joined Anytime Fitness, which was right by my house where I lived when I lived in Madison. I'm not there now, but it was right across the street. I had no excuses. But this is before the pandemic. When could I do this? I'm a morning person, so I literally went to bed every night at 7 o'clock, which completely stunk. I hated that because I felt like I was 7 years old again, going to bed in the summertime with the sun out, people outside playing, and I'm going to bed because I had to get up at 3:30 a.m. I get on my clothes. I go over to Anytime Fitness. I'd have the first sweat going down my face by about 4:05. So I'd be doing my lifting, my cardio stuff. I'd be there until 5 a.m. I'd come home, then I have to take a shower, grab something to eat, then or drive down and take the bus down to downtown Madison to 1 West Wilson, DHS. I did that for 4.5 years. In fact, I still wake up at 3:30 in the morning. My body hasn't caught up with the fact that I don't have to do that anymore. But I had to make a decision to build a different life and to maintain that weight. Unfortunately, the pandemic came along and it kind of goofed up my mojo. So I put on a little bit of weight during the pandemic. I mean, who didn't? But I'm not where I was before. I'm not 270. I'm about 230, around 235 right now. But I need to lose that. But I still every other day I get on my Peloton and I ride. I do really, really intense cardio and I've never stopped. So it's a life that you have to build. So I think that we have to be open to that, whatever that might mean. But these are the traditional ideas of self-care. And I know we've probably been through many self-care trainings. And we're like, yeah, I know. They always talk about proper nutrition, rest, exercise, all those things. These are all extremely important. And I'm not going to minimize any of them because we need to do these. But I like to move more into, there's feel-good self-care, which is laughing, massage, deep breathing, drinking more water, all the things we just talked about. But what about smart self-care? Distinguishing them. What is that? Well, that's about being vulnerable, being real. Like I have to be real with everybody. I need accountability. I need to ask for accountability. I want somebody to call me if they see me not doing what I need to be doing, and I need to be very vulnerable. And that's a big piece of smart self-care. Doing what we can to avoid toxic relationships. And if we have to live with somebody who's a toxic person, that's tougher. I get it. But identifying those people in your life where you need to set some boundaries and stick with them. I certainly have toxic relationships in my life, and I've had to renegotiate my boundaries with them, and I have them at a greater distance from me. We have to develop strategies to address becoming overreactive if that's what we tend to do. Or if we numb out, if we find ourselves dissociating, that could be a symptom of unresolved trauma that we've never dealt with. Having that awareness to know when you're numbing out and what to do about that. And then how to define failure or success. Here comes another story. Early in my career as a therapist, I thought I was going to be the reincarnation of Sigmund Freud. I was going to help everyone that I met as a client was going to get better because of my intervention. They're going to bask in the glow of my infinite wisdom and they'd get better. That was my idealistic thinking as I left graduate school. My first job out of graduate school was working down in Kenosha at a place called Lutheran Social Services. It was Home Community Services. They don't have that anymore. They have a different version of it now. But our job was to come alongside adolescents who had been already adjudicated delinquent and try to keep them in their homes out of placement. The county would pay us to do that. So my first client, 13-year-old kid, and came from trauma, a lot of significant trauma history. And I'm all excited. I'm going to pick him up at school. We have it all arranged. I'm going to go and pick him up, and we're going to go hang out at the park, maybe take him to McDonald's, and just be a role model, a positive role model. I'm 28 years old. I'm come along this kid and just so I have all these ideas. So I go up and I pick him up at school, and he gets in the car. We're leaving, and I'm trying to engage him in conversation. I'm trying to, how was your day? How you doing? I'm Scott, blah, blah, blah. Wouldn't give me anything. He wouldn't say a word. He just sat there looking down with his arms folded. So we get to the first red light, and before I could ask the next question, he looks at me. He tells me to blank off, opens the car door, takes off running at a red light, and disappeared. And I'm like, okay, we never covered this in grad school. What am I going to do? Oh my gosh. What that did, well, we ended up having a pretty good relationship, and it worked out okay. But I just realized that he just turned 50 this year, which really depresses me. Wow, that time flies. But the gift that I got from that experience, I wish I could tell him this actually, is that I had to redefine what success was as a therapist because I thought it was going to help everybody. So I came up with this mantra that I want to do some good for some people some of the time, including myself. And so I've carried that through my entire 40-year career. In fact, I even use it now because in my present position, my job is to go out and provide training and technical assistance around trauma-informed care principles with the hope that organizations will go, ooh, this is really, Scott, this is good stuff. I'd like to become a more trauma-informed organization. That's what I was thinking about. Out of 21,000 people that I've trained since 2014, only 2 organizations have had that conversation with me. Only 2. I always have the same invitation to all of them. So I had to remind myself I want to do some good for some people or organizations some of the time. And you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm at peace with that. That's realistic for me. I don't want to live in the world of unreasonable expectations because that's the setup to get us in trouble and our own self-care. So that defining failure or success needs to be real and needs to be honoring for you. Assertive communication, healthy boundaries. We're going to be talking more about that here at the end of my session. So let's do that right now. I'm just going to check real quick and see if there's any questions that popped up. Nope. If you have any, you can pop them in there. And we're going to leave time for questions at the end here. I'm hoping for 15 minutes of questions. We'll see. Let's start with assertiveness versus aggressiveness. Why do I start here? I think that a lot of people don't want to talk about being assertive because they mistakenly think it's the same as being aggressive. And I don't want to be aggressive. I don't want to be a bully. I don't want to push anybody around. But assertiveness is very different from being aggressive. So let's talk about that. Assertiveness is about being confident, being self-assured in your own thoughts and your own self. And you want to respectfully express your needs, but you have to know what they are. And you have to be tuned into what are my needs? What is it that I'm needing in this situation? And can I ask for what I need? Can I express my need in a respectful way and not be bullying, but be very upfront about it, being direct about it? That's assertiveness because aggressiveness is about attacks, being offensive, invading people's property, their boundaries, making an effort to win at all costs. In any interaction we have, if I'm aggressive, I have to win and you have to lose. That's the way it works. So it's very much competitive. It's very bullying. So hopefully you can see the difference between respectfully expressing your needs and bullying behavior. So on one end of the continuum, we have the passive person. This is the person who's the doormat, where they allow people to walk all over them. They say yes to every request, even though they don't have time, they don't have the energy to do what they want to do. And people will take advantage of passive communication style people because they kind of invite people to wipe their feet on them, the doormat. And so we have to be aware, where are we on this continuum? Because the other side is what we just talked about, the aggressive bully, where I have got to win at all costs. Assertive communication is where we're right in the middle, where you're respectfully expressing your needs, but you have to be able to identify what those needs are and know that you have permission to express those needs. And that's the difference. So that's what we're going to look at here real quickly. How you develop your assertiveness skills. Well, first of all, you've got to kind of figure out what's your style. What kind of style are you going to use? You have to kind of find your voice is another way of saying it. What is your assertive voice? And what should it sound like? I have an example here. Let's say you have an acquaintance or a coworker. They ask you for a favor and you've helped this person so many times before and you're getting tired of it. Your own inner dialogue is like, I don't want to help this person anymore. So how do you respond if they ask you for another favor? The passive response would be, sure, I'd love to help. And then you're kicking yourself inside because you're like, why am I doing this again? I don't want to do this. The aggressive response is very different. I'm tired of your whining and neediness. You never do anything for yourself. Very different style, different tone. The assertives would be, the assertive response would be, I'm not going to be able to help you this time. Doesn't need to be an explanation unless you want to provide one, but it's just, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to help you this time. There is your boundary. Sometimes you have to plan your response. Some people who grew up in families where they felt like they didn't have any power or have a voice, they have to find their voice and they have to kind of plan a response. Like, what do I say? How do I be assertive? So you want to have some ready responses in your back pocket. When you get those requests, when you run it through in your own mind and go, do I really want to do this? No, not really. What can I say to this person? Well, let me get back to you on that, or I need to check my calendar, or I have a schedule conflict, or I won't be able to. So you have to kind of plan your response and have it ready. But the one thing that gets in the way all the time with both setting boundaries and being assertive is guilt. That guilt feeling. Because we feel our inner dialogue would be, maybe people have told us this in our own families, that if you say no, that you're being mean, that you're being a bully, that you're saying no to the person is not rejecting them. You're saying no to the request. You're not saying no to the person themselves. You're not rejecting them. And we have to get those two things straight in our minds and be okay with that. And you have to use positive self-talk. What are some examples of positive self-talk? I work very hard to build up my self-esteem to levels where I can be effective as a helper. I love who I am. I love how I do my work. I want to do everything I can to be as effective as I can in the work that I do, the relationships I form, the family things that I do. I'm worth the effort to work hard, and I'm going to work hard to protect this treasure, which is my self-esteem. And I'm going to protect it from people that want to, come in and take that away from me. So positive self-talk, you're worth the effort. Taking time to breathe. When you get a request, you're not sure what to do, pause. Do some 4-7-8 breathing or square breathing. But 4-7-8 breathing, in case you're wondering, is where you take a inhale for 4 seconds, you hold that breath for 7 seconds, then you exhale for a count of 8. And you can do several sets of that, but what that can do is it really brings you back to baseline. So if somebody is doing things or saying things that you're responding to, or they're making a request you don't want to do, it's okay to pause and do some deep breathing to get yourself centered and then come up with your assertive response. And your body language says a lot too. Standing up straight, looking confident, have your shoulders back, regular eye contact, not the death glare. Don't want that. And having a neutral facial expression is really, really important. Mia says, I know I don't need to provide an answer or reason why I'm being assertive, but I believe I need to justify why. I also would never tell anyone else they need to justify, but can't listen to myself. Okay. Yeah, we don't have to justify. We really don't need to do that, but I get it. I understand what you're saying, Mia. And for a lot of people, this is difficult. I remember I did this training once for a faith group, believe it or not. And afterwards, one of the pastors came up to me and he goes, "This was really good, Scott. And number one, I loved what you had to say. Number two, I'm really bad at this." I think a lot of people in our church are really bad at this too, because a lot of the people in church are caregiver kinds and they just really get racked with guilt. So I feel like this is something that we can all be reminded of and deal with and more effectively. You might have to rehearse with somebody that you trust, that you want to maybe have a script, write down what you want to say. That's an assertive statement. What are your needs for the situation and how do you want to say it? And you have to ask for feedback. Did you come across as too passive, too aggressive? Am I hitting the right tone? And then you might want to remind yourself, how might the other person feel about what you're going to say to them? That's assertive. It's just an internal guide to go make sure that you're kind of hitting that sweet spot between being passive and being aggressive. Get right in the middle for that assertive piece. Believe in your worth. Have positive self-talk. Again, have a balanced sense of self-worth. You are worth this. And start with something small, some small thing. You don't want to go in and try being assertive for the first time with this issue that's so emotionally laden and heavy. We don't want to do that because that's difficult. You want to start with something small, like maybe your significant other left dirty dishes in the sink again, or the kids didn't feed the dog or take the dog out, or whatever. Start with something small and then work on that. And if you really do find yourself struggling still to be assertive, it's okay to ask for outside help with a therapist. That is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength because a therapist, if you get a good one, they can be that objective, give you that objective perspective on things, and they can ask you the right questions to kind of get you thinking, well, what's getting in the way of your being assertive? And then again, working on setting actionable boundaries, which is what we're going to talk about here at the end. This is the forgotten part of smart self-care, setting boundaries. And what is a boundary? Well, it's a limit or an edge that defines you as separate from others. This is my yard right here. This is Scott's world right here. I've got a fence. And then on the other side of that fence is your stuff. It's your yard, it's your issues, it's your thing. And so the boundaries are very different. They differ from person to person. And they vary by culture, personality, social context. In other words, your boundaries at home may be different than your boundaries at work. Maybe people at work you keep at a greater distance. In my family, it's interesting. My wife is Lebanese. And one thing I found when I went to my first Lebanese family reunion is that their personal boundaries are much different than mine. And it's cultural because usually I'm about an arm's length away when I'm talking to somebody. In my wife's family, they're right up in your grill. They're very comfortable being in your space. And there's a lot of hugging and kissing. And it's just something that in my family, we did not do that, to say the least. So it's very different. But setting boundaries defines your expectations about yourself and other people. And a lot of mental health issues, if you think about it, the roots go into conflict with boundaries. So they're an essential part of healthy relationships. We have to think about them that way, that the best relationships that we have, think about this, that you have, I'll bet you that there's some pretty good boundaries there and that those people respect those boundaries as you respect theirs. That mutual respect goes a long way. It's when that lack of respect is there. That's when we know we might be dealing with an aggressive personality style that likes to, or communication style that likes to burst through people's boundaries and take over. But it's a skill that can be developed. It doesn't happen overnight, but they define who you are, what's yours, what isn't yours. And it leads to a sense of ownership and freedom. I really do believe that. When you get good at doing this, it is very freeing and it is powerful in a good way. So there's 10 ways to build and preserve better boundaries. This is how we're going to wrap up today by going through these. What are your limits? Where do you draw your property line? Where do you put the fence? Do you put a gate in your fence? So you have to think about what can you tolerate and accept in others and what makes you uncomfortable or stressed. Think about that. So you have to it's developing boundaries is sort of a journey back into yourself, really tuning into your feelings of discomfort, resentment, because when you start feeling angry, resentful towards somebody, that's when you want to wonder what's going on here where I'm feeling that. Is it a boundary issue? Probably. So we need to think about that. And you might need to be direct with some people when you're setting boundaries because they won't get it. And you have to be very direct and you have to maybe repeat it many times. Others will do okay. They'll do just fine. But some people really need to be given some very clear direction about what your boundaries are. Give yourself permission to set boundaries. You're worth doing that. It's a part of self-care. It's a part of smart self-care. And don't let guilt get in the way. My mom was so good at guilt. She had a black belt in guilting. Oh my gosh. Um, Love you, Mom, but oh my goodness. If I wasn't, for one thing, when I decided to move away from the Fox Valley to move down to Kenosha, you thought that I had committed a capital offense. How could you leave, Nina? Don't you love us? That was the first thing. But then when I would not come home on a weekly basis to visit, what's wrong? Don't you want to be with us? It's that guilt thing. And I'm like, I'm trying to build a new life. I'm trying to build new relationships. I'm trying to emancipate myself from my traumatized family because they hadn't gotten a whole lot better. And so I was trying really hard to set some boundaries for myself for self-care. So to me, it's a sign of healthy relationships and self-respect. And it's about practicing self-awareness, honing in on your feelings like I talked about. If you find that your boundaries are slipping with somebody, it's good to go back and go, okay, time out. What's changed here? Is there something that I'm doing that's changing these boundaries slipping because I'm feeling some anger, some resentment with this person? I feel like they're kind of getting in my yard and I need to remind them to get back in their own yard. What am I doing? What is the other person doing? And how do I work on that and renegotiate and get those boundaries set back up again? Consider your past and present. If you were raised in a family where you were forced to become a caretaker before you were really supposed to, maybe your parents weren't available or they didn't parent very well and you had to take on that role of caretaker, that might be one of the reasons why you might be more passive and why you let people walk all over you and get into your stuff and get into your yard. So do you allow yourself to get drained emotionally and or physically based on poor boundaries and not being assertive? You have to make self-care a priority, like I've talked about. It's not being selfish. And I've heard this from clients back when I was a practicing therapist years ago. We'd have this conversation. They thought self-care meant being selfish, that I'm depriving people of something because I'm putting myself first. And I'm saying, no, that's not being selfish. It's showing self-interest. There's a big difference. So we had to define those terms. What is selfishness versus showing self-interest? Again, like with assertiveness, if you struggle with setting boundaries, that is okay. Because some people come from families where most dysfunctional, broken families that are traumatized, it resembles the lives look like a cooked colander of spaghetti. Your lives are all intertwined and you're in each other's business. It's all enmeshment going on. It's kind of, and when I moved away to Kenosha, I kind of jumped out of that colander. I'm like, I'm going to build my own life over here, separate from all this. So that was, to them, it was like horrible. How could you do this? But it was, no, I need to do this for me. Work on being assertive, start small, like I said before. It's really important to start small with small things, work on setting your boundaries with somebody and see where that goes. Now, here's an example. I'm not going to run through all these right now, but just take a look and see what is not a boundary versus what is a boundary. You just kind of get an idea what this might look like. I'm going to jump in on one of them. I thought it was interesting about weight. Yeah, I know I gained a few pounds. You don't need to be concerned though, versus I am not okay with you commenting on my weight. Please stop. That might feel very, very like you might go, ooh, I don't know if I could do that. But it is respectful and it is setting a boundary and it's being assertive. This is assertiveness and boundary setting rolled into one. I also like this one on the bottom. Oh, interesting. I didn't notice that about her. And I don't find it okay to gossip about my friend. You can also say, please stop. But you can get an idea what this looks like. I think Noel Mustafa does a nice job of showing what these are. And then another one, I really like this. I just found this fairly recently from Sincerely Carrie Jean. What is a boundary? Be aware of what is unacceptable and normalize saying no. Do what is best for you and know that it's not your responsibility to sacrifice yourself for others. Absolutely love this. This is exactly what we've been talking about. And for those of us who come from traumatized families, this could be terrifying. But just be okay with knowing that this is something that we can work on. We can work at becoming more assertive. We can work at setting boundaries with other people. And you're going to find that that is a much healthier place to exist. And you're going to be much more effective at your work because this builds resiliency. So healthy boundaries, declining things you don't want to do, expressing your feelings responsibly, talking about your experiences. Hopefully this is all helpful. So building your resiliency, just very quickly, I want to touch on this a little bit, and then we'll take questions if there are any. Any good self-care plan should have as its goal to build your resiliency reserves so that you can do the work that you've been asked and called on to do and not feel like you need to walk around and deal with compassion fatigue or burnout and trying to be effective at what you do. We don't want to go there. Let's know that we're going to deal with secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and we have to really look at this resilience, which is really the capacity to heal from trauma, which means digging in the dirt and strengthening your well-being and adaptability. And that's all that we've been talking about today. That's resilience is this. I love this definition, and it aligns perfectly with what we've been talking about for the last 90 minutes or so. Actually, 75 minutes. So it's a skill set. Like everything else we've talked about today, it's all a skill set. And it requires you to be flexible and try to tap into your innate optimism that you can do this. You can work on becoming more assertive. You can set good boundaries with people and hold those boundaries and give yourself permission that if they're slipping, that you can come back and reset that. So having that confidence in coping and really have a challenge orientation versus a threat. Like, we face challenges all the time. And we don't want to look at them as threats to our self-esteem or to our own health and well-being. These are challenges that need to be overcome. But we have a roadmap how we can do it. And we can help each other. We can support each other while we're doing that really important work. So some key takeaways today. Vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress are real. They're out there. Can't escape them, especially in the work that we do. Compassion fatigue and burnout are prevalent in our field of work. Self-care is not a buzzword. It's a priority. I've learned that firsthand. And self-care, assertiveness, setting healthy boundaries, they're all intertwined. And finally, you are worth the effort. And what I'd invite you to do today, before I do that, I want to just talk about, I think a lot of us in the helping professions may be trauma survivors ourselves, and we may be broken by what we've gone through. But hopefully, by getting healed in our trauma, that those healing experiences will be like gold in that broken vessel. And I love this kintsugi and kintsukuroi, which is golden repair, where you take a broken vessel and you fix it with gold and it actually looks more beautiful. And it emphasizes not the break, not hides it. We end up being these beautifully broken people. I think a lot of the trauma survivors I've met who've done their work, who are doing amazing work out there in the communities, they're very effective at what they do because they have made this journey. They have worked on healing themselves and they have given themselves permission to self-care. And they're in a very, very good spot. So consider a self-care plan. And one of the handouts that you have today, it's in the chat. And I think it was also part of an email that may have gone out. But I'd invite you to take, this is just page one. It's a 2-pager. But I want you to take some time, copy off this self-care assessment and go through it. Be very real, be vulnerable, do some good, smart self-care, and just kind of look at where you're at. Do you do it really well, or do you never do it? And really look at what you could do and under physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual self-care, and really work on this, and then share it with a loved one, and ask for accountability. Maybe they could take it too, and you could go on this journey, the self-care assessment journey together, because I really don't want anybody on this call today to struggle. We need you in this work. We need you in this field. You are heroes and you are amazing, amazing, amazing people. And I want you to stay healthy and do good work, because I don't want you to end up like me, in a cath lab having 4 stents put in your heart while they're racing to save your life. You don't want to get to that point. That is not okay. So I hope that you'll take the time to do that. Don't know if there's any questions, but I'll take any questions that are out there. Again, I'm not an expert on anything. I'm just a fellow traveler, but I do have some resources for you that you can look at that are hyperlinked. And I also have my email. Again, I'm retiring on October 4th, so I won't be in this job anymore. But if you want to find me via LinkedIn, there's my LinkedIn profile page. If you want to reach out with any questions, that's the best way to find me after October 4th. So with that, I will see if there's any questions. We've got look at that, 14 minutes. Thank you, Paula. Yeah, it's terrifying and exciting at the same time. I've been told it's like jumping off a cliff. It is. Like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? But I'll be 65 next week. I figured, it's probably a good time to go. Yeah, Leslie's also pointed out there's a place to share your thoughts on the training today. Love to get the feedback as well. Any last questions? You're welcome, Lori. Thank you. Yes, Ariel, I'm glad you're a bit convicted, and that's okay. We're really good at giving those advice to other people, but we really need to do it ourselves. I get it totally. But once you start doing it and you see how good it feels, do you have any suggestions for giving ourselves grace and permission to sort of, I would journal. If you're a writer, I would journal. I think journaling is good for a good journey in for introspection. That's always been helpful for me about reminding myself of what I'm worth the effort to do this, and I want to be effective at what I do. And maybe looking each at the end of each day, just thinking, how did I do today? Did I win the day? Did I win the day? Did I do everything I could to set those boundaries and be assertive and stand up for myself? That's always important to do that. I'm glad you all learned. Well, thank you, Darlene. Appreciate that. Oh, you're very welcome, Judy. Thank you.
Scott, this is Suzanne. I just want to say thank you so much. You've been such an inspiration in the trauma-informed care movement. I met you like 10 years ago when Clark County received a trauma-informed care grant, and you came and trained our staff. It was absolutely inspiring. Recently, when you came to one of our management meetings, when you were moving as we were struggling with a loss of a consumer, you came, and the words that you gave to our management team so we could help support our team was absolutely amazing. So thank you so much. And you are truly, truly, truly going to be truly, truly going to be missed. So
Oh, thank you, Suzanne. That makes me feel so good. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I'm looking back over my 10 years and I feel like I've done the best work I can do. And I don't think they're going to be replacing me at DHS, unfortunately, but I'm still out there. If anybody needs to find me, they can get me on LinkedIn if they need help with anything. But thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate those words. All right. Well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen then. And I think we are probably going to close a tad early, but if there are no other questions, I think we'll try to find my counterparts here where they are.
Yes, I
There.
think we can wrap up. Thank you again to Scott for taking the time with us today. Thank you to everybody for joining us. We will be sending a follow-up email after the trainings are completed. We have another event this afternoon. If you found this training valuable and would like to share with others, please let them know there is another opportunity to join us this afternoon. But we'll be sending a follow-up email with the handout, the self-assessment, and the presentation, as well as the link to the feedback form and the recording as well. We'll be sharing that as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Take care, everybody.